You probably know author M.T. Anderson best for his award-winning young adult novel Feed, which predicted our current algorithm culture in a really uncanny way. But today we are talking about his adult novel. I read somewhere adult debut, but I don't want to 100% commit to that because it doesn't feel right. Nicked, which, if Feed is looking to the future and in an oddly prescient way, Nicked is commenting on our current moment through the lens of the past, specifically through the lens of a medieval heist of the bones of a saint. But before we go on this adventure together, hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and whether you've been here before or not, I would love for you to hang out more, so consider liking and subscribing. But with that, let us dive in to Nicked, which, like I said, is a heist novel which follows predominantly our monk Nicephorus, who gets a dream from St. Nicholas. Yes, that St. Nicholas. And this dream is spun by the leaders of Barry, the city he is in, the plague-stricken city he is in, as a sign from the saint that they were meant to house St. Nicholas's bones, which coincidentally aligns with the arrival of a saint hunter, Tyron, who has offered them a deal. He has been employed by Vienna to acquire these bones, but wouldn't you know it, for double the cost, he will work on behalf of Barry. But they need to send someone that they know is on their side, or to kind of guide this mission, because it needs to look at least a little above board. And so they send Nicephorus as well. And so they go off with Nicephorus, the saint hunter, as well as kind of like some muscle from the city, and they are on the quest to obtain St. Nicholas's bones. And St. Nicholas's bones, according to the blurb, because I was not raised Catholic, so I don't know if this is known information about St. Nicholas's bones or not, but they weep a mysterious liquid that can heal the sick. And so we placed it very specifically in this moment. And I am very interested, like I said, in how this book positions, in what it's saying and how it's speaking to the current moment through the lens of the past. I've mentioned before that I come from a theatrical background, and so I really am thinking about the question, why this play, why here, why now, except, with a book. Now, I don't think that historical fiction necessarily has to answer that question. I think usually it does, even if it's in a more subtle way. However, I do think that this book, especially with it being shorter, feels like it needs to have something to say. And on page 1, we have this sentence or line that also may just be echoing and invoking Dickens, but it says, "In an age of sickness, in a time of rage, in an epoch when tyrants take their seats beneath the white domes of capitals," which obviously is, or not obviously, I feel like it is intended to invoke the current moment very specifically, and I would put money on that. And so we have this idea of how this is in commentary with the current moment, and I think that that kind of resonates throughout the book, specifically in the language and style of the book. Now, as you maybe saw, it is not a long book. That being said, I didn't fly right through this book, and that could have been on me. I don't know. When we think of young adult fiction, particularly young adult fiction of the mid-2000s, where Feed lives and where the fiction from M.T. Anderson that I grew up on lived, like I mentioned in my Uglies trailer video, M.T. Anderson and Scott Westerfeld really live in the same kind of realm mentally for me when I think about my reading life historically. And so M.T. Anderson did not just write Feed and futuristic novels. He also had The Astonishing Life of Octavian Nothing. He had Thirst, which is a vampire book, and I don't remember anything about the book, to be completely honest, other than I bought it at a mall bookstore in Indianapolis on a school field trip to the symphony. So I'm not saying that there's not a precedent for Anderson to be exploring this kind of realm, but this is the first time I'm reading it from an adult point of view and an adult standpoint. And there is a definite difference in perspective there and tone, I would argue. I wrote in trying to kind of place the tone and sense of humor of this, that it was irreverent, dark, cynical humor, nihilistic, just trying to kind of figure out where it was sitting. And early on, I kind of placed it in the same kind of realm as something like George Saunders, where you kind of have to trust the process a little bit, which is kind of ironic because I said that and I was very proud of myself. I'm not gonna lie. I'm like, look at these literary connections I am making. And then of course there is a blurb from George Saunders on the back. So I mean, I got it right, but also in terms of our reading life, or my reading life, or the kind of collective reading life on the channel just this year, I would also tie this in with Glorious Exploits or the Alvaro Enrique, in the sense that it does have this kind of irreverent, dark humor, and that it is a little punchier, a little slap happy almost at some points, but it has this kind of darker kind of commentary on the human condition and the human experience, and it kind of shows our baser natures here, because we have this monk who believes in this vision but doesn't believe in the interpretation of the vision that is being presented, and watches as it is twisted for opportunistic reasons. But he's also a very kind of buttoned up character that doesn't really have a sense of the world. And the characters in this were kind of hard for me, but I want to circle back to that because I want to sit in this kind of difference of perspective for a second between like young adult, middle grade, and adult fiction. Because there is a little bit more weight to it, a little less hope, even if the ending could still be interpreted as hopeful. But the entire kind of conceit of the novel is exploring the kind of use of religious symbols for personal and political gain, and how we as individuals kind of operate within that system and what choices we can make. And we see all of the kind of sides of it in a lot of ways. But again, the tone of that stands in contrast to a lot of previous work. And it makes me think of, and this is going to be a very kind of convoluted down the line interpretation of this idea, but when I saw Kelly Barnhill talk years ago, as I've mentioned before, and she had this really great exploration of the kind of perspective differences between middle grade, young adult, and adult. And there's this sense in adult, and this is my own kind of editorializing of this because I lost the note on this long ago and I'm still devastated by it, don't worry. But in adult, you're kind of looking back in some ways. And this is reflected in this narrative by the third person point of view, the third person past point of view, which makes sense in a historical novel. I'm also not saying this is always the case in adult fiction. Obviously, we have first person present, first person general, third, you know, there are all kinds of points of view, but just the sense of the larger idea of perspective and the kind of tone and energy that is being brought to the narrative and the kind of reflectiveness of it. We're looking back instead of looking forward in some ways, even if the plot is still pushing forward. Additionally, when I said that it's kind of like George Saunders in some ways, where you kind of have to trust the process, this I want to unpack a little bit more, because I'm thinking particularly of the opening story of his most recent short story collection, where I just had to kind of go along for the ride and trust where we were going, because I was very confused at first. And I'm not going to lie to you, and I consider myself a reasonably intelligent person. I like to think I have a good insight, especially into books every once in a while, but I struggled with this a lot of the time in terms of the language, in terms of just the logistics of what was going on. There was an entire character in this book that was the dog-headed man, and I could not figure out, and I'm still a little unsure if this was a very literal dog-headed man, or if this was a medieval term that I just wasn't remembering or am not familiar with. And I think based on the author's note, I'm leaning toward literal, but I still don't 100% know. And the language in this was still very punchy and action focused with that sense of humor behind everything. So the action moves theoretically, because we do have this, like I said, dialogue forward movement or focus, but I, as a reader, got lost in that. Especially because even with this conceivably punchier focus, the language itself was just denser, which is fine. I don't mind dense language. In fact, sometimes I like dense language, but it felt needlessly opaque. I don't quite understand what it was trying to do. And then even within the action sequences then, especially toward the later half of the book where things were moving very quickly and were action forward, I got lost in that action. Now, to be fair, I'm not great at tracking action. It is just something I experienced as a reader though. And additionally, because of this and the way that the focus was, in terms of the characters, to swing back to the characters, I didn't really feel like I got a good sense of the characters. At first, I was really enjoying the humor of things. I was enjoying getting to know these characters more through dialogue. And again, I have a theatrical background. I worked with plays a lot as a literary manager, dramaturg, kind of focused individual. And so I am not unfamiliar with dialogue only plot development and movement. So that in and of itself wouldn't or shouldn't be a hindrance to me, the fact that it's dialogue forward. However, I didn't really feel like I got a sense of these characters. For half of the book at least, I was getting the Saint Hunter sometimes confused with other characters because I couldn't really get a sense of them. I had the best sense of Nicephorus, I feel like, you know what, we're gonna go with it, the monk, especially because his dialogue was very revealing. It was kind of that awkward conversation where he would just like kind of come in and start going off on soliloquies, which I found really funny. I thought that worked really well and revealed a lot about him, and we kind of saw that arc with him over the course of the book, but we never really got to stay with him enough where we felt the emotional weight of that arc. And I'm not saying I needed to like be in it with him, because again, the kind of comedic distance of the narrative, I understood that, I got that, but I also never felt invested enough in the characters to really care. And then on top of this, while we have this kind of exploration and real indictment in some ways of modern culture through the lens of the past, and this idea of like con men at its heart, and the way that religion is frequently used in a very mercenary way, and its exploration of miracles at the end of the day, all of these things that had these really good germs of ideas, but I don't know if the narrative fully took ownership of it, because this expedition was apparently based on a real expedition. So it kind of goes back to the question that we have in retellings of myths, and a question that's just a little bit more frequent in historical fiction of, does it take ownership of the story enough? And I do think it does in terms of form and tone, regardless of whether or not I personally find them effective. But at the same time, it never feels like it fully commits to the characters. And if we kind of contrast this against Glorious Exploits from earlier this year, where we had a very similar kind of exploration and tone, a similar irreverence, and the characters at the center of that story were inherently flawed. I mean, we're all inherently flawed, but I hope you were on the same kind of track with me here. But I still cared about those characters, and I found the heart in those characters more than I did here. And it's interesting in context of this quote from the book I wrote down too that says, "You're a salesman of miracles, Tyan, but you can't see the wonders waiting all around you," because it felt like it was supposed to be exploring that difference of the wonders all around us, and almost kind of like Monty Python and the Holy Grail-esque at times, because we do kind of split up on separate quests for a very brief period, and it's kind of this exploration of like this quest, and the almost kind of like nihilistic exploration of what the outcome of that quest is and what this idea of miracles represents. Though I don't think it is completely nihilistic about that, and it's not totally discrediting this idea of miracles, even if it's very much exploring the kind of exploitation of them, but just kind of the personal weight of what we believe and our beliefs. And I think that there was an avenue to explore that a little bit more deeply while still having these comedic moments that it just didn't fully execute. But at the same time, I can't help feeling like maybe I just missed something, especially when thinking of it in context of the title of the book, Nicked, which has so many different interpretations that all are so interesting and smart in context of the story being told. We've got, of course, Nicked in context of the fact that we are exploring Saint Nicholas. And I did like a lot of the backstory and side stories we got in relation to Saint Nicholas as someone who is not familiar with Saint Nicholas as a historical kind of entity or even a mythological kind of entity outside of Santa Claus. And then we have Nicked in terms of stealing something, taking something that doesn't belong to you, which is the entire conceit of the book. But then additionally, Nicked as in just kind of barely grazing. And I feel like this book kind of barely grazes the surface. And in some ways then, in context especially of the title, I feel like that is incredibly intentional. And so I have to wonder if some of the obscuring of the language is on purpose, as well as what is not explored and not said. We're barely kind of touching the surface so that we can mythologize in our own ways. We can fill in the blanks as readers and kind of build out in the same way that these myths perpetuate from the kind of germs of the idea of a saint. Again, not an expert on saints. But in context of the blurb from the book, at the end it says, a swashbuckling saga, a medieval novel noir, a meditation on the miraculous, and a monastic meet-cute filled with wide-eyed wonder at the world that awaits beyond our own borders. Okay, yes, there is a small romantic subplot, but it is very small, so I mean, that's just good copywriting. But I'm just fascinated by the idea of like the world that awaits beyond our own borders, because we are really kind of seeing the wider world with Nicephorus. And so I think a lot of this is just him getting outside of the monastery and seeing the world in some ways. But I wish we got a better sense of that at the end of the day. And maybe again, the commentary is that even when we're seeing the wider world, we're still seeing such a small sliver of it, or that the small sliver that he's seeing still widens the world so much for him. I don't know. I think there's a lot to unpack and think about here. I don't think this was a completely unsuccessful novel by any means, but I didn't find it a particularly enjoyable or rewarding reading experience at the time. That being said, there were still moments I found humorous. For instance, toward the end of the novel, when they are attempting to find where St. Nicholas is being kept in this particular church, they are basically threatening the keepers of this church. And they basically kind of have them at sword point. It's a kind of tense moment. And then all of a sudden, this group of mourners and the entire production of that with their hired mourners comes and sweeps in and upsets that dynamic. And our adventurers and the keepers kind of have to pretend that nothing is going on, even as one of these mourners is asking one of the brothers about like a contract or something he's written up for him. And he's like, why don't you go get that for me? And the guy's like, oh, I'll get it later, even though, you know, so it's just this moment. There are moments of humor here, absolutely. And I wish we could have gotten more moments like that, the kind of absurd. I liked the moments where we really kind of relished in the absurd. And I think the absurd, and maybe that's the word I've been looking for the whole time, it just took me a lot of babbling to get there. That is where I think this book sits. And I think that that makes so much sense within the context of the medieval as well, and just what was going on at this time. The concept and idea and perception of miracles, the idea of dog-headed men. At the beginning of the book, heck, there's a guy getting pushed around in a wheelbarrow that really did make me think of Bring Out Your Dead as well, not to just make Monty Python references the whole time. But I think that pushing into that even more while developing out the characters a little bit more, I liked the realm we were sitting in. It just felt a little needlessly dense and obscured at times. And so I guess I don't know where I'm ultimately sitting with that, but that's how I'm feeling right now. So if you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave those below. Like and subscribe again if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah. Bye.